Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for May 21st, 2021. Since it's Friday, I'll be taking your questions, but let me begin with a quick update on some very important events. We start with the fact that there is a conference in Rome today on global health care. The Schiller Institute has been involved in a mobilization for it. We expect they'll have some kind of general statement on vaccine sharing, but our intervention has been aimed at getting a consensus that what's needed is move to a new platform of infrastructure for the whole world, which includes an upgrade to a modern healthcare system for every country. So we'll have an update for you on that on Monday, what happened at that conference. Secondly, we have the agreement reached for a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine. This was largely a staged operation. It was staged in the sense that the Israelis carried out actions that provoked a rebellion, provoked a response from Hamas by moving into Al-Aqsa Mosque and by upholding the eviction of Palestinians from an East Jerusalem neighborhood. The end result of this is mass destruction in Gaza. A handful of Israelis killed, close to 300 Palestinians killed, including more than 60 children. It remains to be seen how a peace can actually be achieved when there's no fundamental change in the rights of the Palestinians, no change in the economy, no change toward an upgrading of the infrastructure in Gaza, which is really defined as an open-air prison camp by many people. Now, on the positive side, there was a very significant video conference yesterday between Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping to discuss the beginnings of, or the beginning construction of 4 nuclear plants in China with the China-Russia cooperation. Xi said in the discussion that this will make a, quote, sizable intellectual contribution to the innovation-driven development of the global nuclear sphere, unquote. It's an explicit commitment to a future which rejects the Malthusianism of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. And it can be expected that this will inspire other countries. We see now, for example, El Salvador moving toward relationships with Russia and China on infrastructure development, on healthcare, whereas the U.S. policy towards El Salvador is sanctions. As far as Africa, we see Russia and China talking about the possibility of deploying small modular reactors for electricity for countries where whole sections of the population lack electricity. Now, the transatlantic think tanks like the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, are all worrying, almost hyperventilating, about what they see as the danger of a Russia-China military alliance. Well, in fact, the only reason there would be a Russia-China military alliance is that the Western drive against Russia and China, including regime change activities against both countries, sanctions, and so on, has convinced leaders in both countries that they may be facing an attack from the U.S., British, NATO alliance. And so therefore, it's not surprising that they might move toward a military alliance. But the real fear of these think tanks is that Russia and China reject the Great Reset, reject the Green New Deal, and are forming a development partnership which is very popular with many countries in what used to be called the developing sector. And then finally, yesterday, there was a meeting between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Secretary of State Blinken. Lavrov approached it optimistically. He said there's a basis for talks. The State Department used it to put out another laundry list of malign intent from Russia that has to change if there is to be effective cooperation. So the world is hanging in balance right now. Let's take a look at some of the questions that I got from viewers. The first one, well, I'll take two together. It's, can the principle of the coincidence of opposites be applied to solve the Israel-Palestine seemingly permanent crisis? And can the ceasefire hold? Well, I think in my opening comments I made the point that it's fragile. The reason it might not be able to hold is that what's changed? Any improvement of life for the Palestinians? No. Any restraint on Israeli military action? Well, Netanyahu was allowed to carry on his assault against the Palestinians until he decided to stop. There was no restraint from a push from Biden or the West. They let him do what he wanted to do. Now, the only way you could apply this principle of the coincidence of opposites there is to recognize that a military security solution doesn't work in the absence of an economic solution. Likewise, a political solution doesn't work. Pledging to recognize each other's existence and so on means nothing. A real peace depends on creating conditions where there's a benefit for each in the improvement of the other. That's where the coincidence of opposites come in. For example, Palestine has a very difficult situation as far as medical care. 18 hospitals were attacked by the Israeli assault. The number of people vaccinated in Palestine is extremely low, whereas Israel has one of the highest rates of vaccination in the world. If you really wish to achieve a peace agreement, you have to have something along the lines of LaRouche's Oasis Plan, which provides the Palestinians with a pathway toward industrial development, for modern infrastructure, and for decent jobs and a future for its growing population. Would this sacrifice the security of Israel if the Palestinians lived better? No, that's the only way to ultimately guarantee the security of Israel. As Rabin said, Israel's security is not based on its military power, but on a recognition that both sides have done too much damage to each other, and that both sides can find a confluence of a willingness to cooperate based on improving the living standards of both peoples. So from that standpoint, the coincidence of opposites can be applied, that what seems to be opposite, what seems to be contradictory, can be resolved by moving into a new paradigm of economic cooperation between not just the two groups in that small geographical area, but the whole region, turning Southwest Asia into a region of reconstruction from the wars and economic development that leapfrogs, including modern transportation, modern water systems, including desalination. These are the areas that would be important, and also healthcare, to guarantee a peace in that area, which has been targeted since the end of the 19th century by British geopolitics as a cockpit of war, terrorism, and chaos. Second question, what can we do about the revolving door between the CIA, intelligence, the military-industrial complex, Congress, and the think tanks? Well, there has been some legislation passed that says that you can't go directly from the military into working for companies that oversee, that are involved in defense contracting. Most of that doesn't matter, though. The only way to change this is to defeat the idea that we need a military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is not just defense contractors. It's a whole array of activities now, including cyber technologies, for example, Silicon Valley, including the consultants and the mercenaries who are being brought in to fight wars. Look, what's a good way to address this? The military should be much more oriented toward the idea of an Army Corps of Engineers. Look at what could be done with the pandemic. China built a 1,000-bed hospital in less than a week. They built several of them. The United States actually did something similar with the Jacob Javits Convention Center, with the hospital ship. We could be building toward a modern healthcare infrastructure with military capability. The military also could be deployed for famine relief in Africa. So one of the ways to change this revolving door, which means you have intelligence people, CIA people rewarded with rich contracts when they leave government service. One of the ways to do it is to change the function of the military and the intelligence services. This is something that's possible if we could get a full declassification, public declassification of the corruption of military and intelligence networks in Russiagate, the corruption involved in the so-called security state, the cyber spying, and so on, and the use of advanced cybernetic capabilities, the manipulation of popular opinion. It's not just spying, but it's actually developing capabilities that change the way people think. So if we clean out this idea that we have to be prepared for an immediate war with Russia and China, if we get rid of that, if we actually move toward cooperation, cooperation on space, cooperation on advanced energy technology, on disease, on resolving the problems of food shortages and famine, if we had a commitment for that, you take the money rewards out of military service, then moving from that into the boardrooms and moving from that into Congress. But short of a change, and that's why Helga Zepp-LaRouche has insisted we need a new paradigm, short of that kind of change, you're not going to pass a law that will stop people from taking advantage of the ability to make money from a corrupt system. The positive thing is this corrupt system is collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The problem is if we don't move to clear it out and put in an alternative, that collapse could have huge collateral damages to the civilian population of the United States. Now finally, there's an interesting question. What role does art play in moral education? We'll go back to what we were just talking about. We have so much of our culture shaped by violent video games, by violent movies and television shows. How many shows are there about murder and solving murder? You know, we have a culture which glorifies the most bestial aspects of human beings, the greed, the lifestyles of the rich and famous. But more importantly, the idea of the pursuit of the nobility of classical culture has very little place in our modern pantheon of heroes. Instead, we have Batman and Spider-Man. But we don't have what John Kennedy once called for, which is that we should honor our artists in the same way we honor success in business or sports. Now, that requires, again, a change in thinking. The classical culture, the idea of man in classical culture, is of a creative being, a loving being, an empathetic being, which is in coherence with the monotheistic religion's view of the nature of man. That man is not primarily driven by his creature comforts, his greed, his sexual desires, but has a higher purpose. And that's what art can foster, not just by presenting examples of it, but by inspiring in the minds of those who participate in art, who go to concerts, who go to operas, who go to museums, that they can be inspired by a different conception of man than man as the Terminator-type Schwarzenegger rampaging through the jungle trying to gain more power. So the moral education starts with this conception that all human beings share basic common needs, and that that's something that they can join together through government to meet. But that's not enough. What defines those needs? The future. Man's imagination is the most powerful weapon that we actually have. And man's ability to make hypotheses. How do you shape that? Well, that's where classical art and classical culture come in. And this is something that the Schiller Institute has been focused on for a long time, since its founding, because that was the goal of Friedrich Schiller, to carry on a commitment to an aesthetical education of human beings. And that's something which should be not just the commitment of private foundations and private museums and so on, but of the government to support and inspire people to participate in developing a higher conception of the noble capacity of human beings. If we do that, and we can move people out of this idea of the macho triumphalism of winning wars and crushing the enemy, but instead looking at how we can work together to provide for those who need help, this is the way you can change it. And art can play an enormously important role in that. As bad art has played an enormously important role in degrading human culture. So that's my update for today. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you Monday.